Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to today's Better Managers Briefing. I'm Anne Franca, the CEO of the Chartered Management Institute, and every Friday at this time, we bring you news and views on management topics that matter. Now, today I'm delighted to have as my guests Ben Harrison, who is the director of the Work Foundation, a leading think tank for improving work in the UK, and Professor Angus Laing, the Dean of Lancaster University Management School, Chair of the Work Foundation Advisory Board, and a CMI companion. Welcome to both of you.
Thank you.
Now, let's start talking a little bit about the Work Foundation's work and your rationale for embedding it into a leading business school. Angus, can you share your thoughts?
Yeah, as a business school dean for a number of years and other institutions, I've always been struck we produce great knowledge. There's really good thinking around management practice, business development in business schools, but we often fail to reach out to engage with not so much businesses, but policymakers in particular. And it always struck me that there would be huge value in a business school having a think tank that enables us to take the intellectual content, the intellectual expertise we have, and take it out to speak to policymakers. And for me, the opportunity, just as I started at Lancaster, the university had acquired the Work Foundation. The opportunity to embed it into the management school gave us that opportunity to have a route into taking our research and speaking to policymakers very effectively. And it's about us being able to deliver engaged, impactful research that's going to make a difference on people's lives, either on people's lives through the way organizations operate, or particularly with the Work Foundation, the way in which policy is framed. And I've been delighted with the progress we've made with the Work Foundation under Ben's leadership. We've drawn in an increasing number of academics into engaging with policymakers, and I think we will unequivocally be seeing more of that in coming years. Ben's far better placed than I am to talk more about the work that the Work Foundation actually does and how we've actually done that.
Well, Ben, what advantages do you see being affiliated with a leading business school like Lancaster?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think really building on what Angus has said, I think for us as a policy think tank, the opportunity to engage directly with academics who are leading research on cutting edge management practices within the school, as well as looking at those who are doing research on the wider future of the world of work across the university. Even in the last year alone, we've collaborated with Lancaster academics around the gender pay gap, issues related to disability and home working, as well as financial insecurity and mental health in relation to the pandemic. And it's really in bringing together that deep research that academics are doing with the more practice and policy focus of the Work Foundation's research agenda that I think we can produce really impactful outputs and ultimately make a much bigger contribution to improving the world of work for the future. And I suppose the final thing I would say is that it's really valuable to us having a base in the north of England. Mm-hmm. We don't want to be a London-centric organisation, and being part of Lancaster affords us fantastic connections and engagement with practitioners and policymakers in the Northwest, but also across the whole of the country.
Yeah, which is a great point. And I know at CMI, we did help with the gender pay work that you did at Lancaster, and we're happy to contribute. And we're collaborating again, and maybe we'll touch on that a bit later. But you mentioned Lancaster, and of course, there is a lot of talk about how we need to do more post-COVID to level up and boost the regional economic firepower in the UK economy. What are your views, and how do you think organizations and individuals can contribute, and what would you like to see the government do? Maybe start with you, Ben.
Sure. So I guess the first important thing to note here is that there have been voices calling for the rebalancing of the economy away from London and the Southeast for a long, long time. Mm-hmm. Not just decades, but actually throughout the last century. There have been various commissions and policy initiatives all geared around trying to achieve that shift. And thus far, it's fair to say not many have really achieved real change. But I don't think this is going to be something that can happen overnight. It's going to require a sustained policy focus, a sustained investment. And I think one of the big things that you notice when you look at the data is that the big cities outside of London, whether that's Manchester or Birmingham, Glasgow, Cardiff, underperform compared to similar sized cities across Europe. And although in recent years we've seen some progress with the Northern Powerhouse agenda, devolution, actually there's a lot more that needs to be done to support those provincial cities to punch their weight. And of course, levelling up can't just be about those places either. It must be about the wider prosperity of surrounding towns and rural areas as well. And I suppose one thing I would say is where I think we might have got a bit wrong in the past is perhaps an overemphasis on imagining that investment in capital infrastructure will be the thing that turns around struggling economies, that somehow new trains or new trams will be the key to unlocking growth. And actually, in my view, the much bigger priority should be skills, ensuring people have the skills that mean they're going to be able to access good jobs in the future that are well paid, that are secure, meaning that businesses and employers can look at an area and have confidence that if they choose to locate their business there, they're going to be able to access the talent that they need in order to grow and fulfill their potential as well. So I think that should really be a very big part of the levelling up agenda. And it's encouraging to see that the government has made steps as we emerge out of the pandemic to be thinking about lifelong learning, adult education, technical education that can perhaps support that shift over the coming years.
So that's a great point. Skills, not trains. Angus, do you agree?
Oh, I completely agree. If I'd been starting off first, I'd have made the comment that all too often infrastructure is the focus of is the focus of investment, not the softer side, not the investment in human capital, not the investment in people. And this whole skills agenda is critical. I'd probably take it a little bit further and maybe look at it from a fraction of different angles from which Ben would be looking at it. I think we need to really focus on investment in creating and facilitating a wider ecosystem of innovation, creating an ecosystem that draws together a range of actors around place. And I think we're hearing at last, and I really welcome it, an emphasis in government policy on place and being able to draw sets of regional actors, businesses, policymakers, educational institutions, the health service, because I mean, health and wealth is inevitably interconnected, bringing them together collectively to create an effective ecosystem. And I think that's something that a top university, a leading management school, particularly one with a think tank, is actually able to influence and make quite a difference on. And we've done work over many years in this territory, very often funded by either government or European funding. Our latest bids are in through the Community Renewal Fund, very much operating in about creating these ecosystems, but underpinning that, and coming back to Ben's point about skills, and I know it's something that you individually, but you representing the CMI are particularly keen on, is around the leadership skills. Yeah. Organizational leadership is the key bit here. And over many years through our LEAD program and GOLD program, and now productivity through people, made smarter, evolved digital, amongst others, we work with a vast array of small, medium-sized and large companies to improve the quality of leadership. We know work that's done at Lancaster, work that's done at the LSE and other places highlights quite clearly the impact that good leadership is having, good management is having on economic performance. And if we see that much of the problem of the long tail of productivity is around our SMEs, our regional economies, particularly the non-metropolitan regional economies, are very heavily anchored based on our SMEs. So being able to reach out to them effectively, being able to upskill those types of businesses is hugely important. And I think it is, I'm relieved that the government has recognised this with the Help to Grow scheme being backed by the Chancellor.
Absolutely, and of course I am really proud and pleased to be on that advisory council for Help to Grow, and I agree with you, it's great to see the government recognising the importance of skills, especially management and leadership skills, as you say. Now, of course, there are also new sectors coming out of the recovery, and obviously the green economy is a keen industry, seen as a key industry coming out. And how do you see that develop? And I know, Ben, you've done some work recently on this for the Lancaster area.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you're absolutely right, Anne, to sort of highlight new and growing sectors. I mean, the transition to net zero, in one way or another, is going to impact all jobs right the way across the country. Is that substantial a shift in how we live our lives and how we think about work? But I think there are going to be specific impacts around energy generation, around housing, around construction, manufacturing, that is going to have a real seismic shift in those sectors. And born partly out of the creation of new businesses and new kinds of activities, new technologies, but also the shift away from some other practices. And so we may also see jobs lost as part of this transition. I mean, the National Grid has estimated that we'll need to recruit to over 400,000 jobs to reach net zero by 2050. That's going to run the full gamut from civil and mechanical and electrical engineers through data analysts, machine learning experts, as well as the more traditional skilled tradespeople. And so I think what's going to be really important here, particularly for an area like Lancashire and the northwest of England, but there are many others across the country where there is an underlying base of activity within these sorts of sectors already, is to approach this in a really strategic way, working with businesses in these sectors to really understand the skills needs that they're going to have as they seek to grow and scale up their activity over the coming period. It's going to need to be backed by investment from government as well. There's no doubt about that. But as Angus was alluding to before, joining up that sort of panoply of local actors that very often makes life pretty difficult, to sort of find a way through for employers and businesses, will be key, underpinned by local skills plans that can essentially help guide the strategic direction over the coming period.
And Angus, I know you are a big believer in the green economy as well. What would you add to that?
I mean, I'd take a slight step back and look at some of the work the Work Foundation did around job losses and then new job opportunities arising in COVID as a starting point. And what that highlights is the alarming sense that jobs are lost for people with a particular set of skills, but the new jobs are created either in slightly new geographies or with very different skill mix. And it's going to be, and so if we take that as an example and then look to the shift to the green economy, it is going to be a magnification of the scale of that challenge. So I think for professional bodies like the CMI, for institutions like universities, for further education colleges, there is going to be a need for a huge reskilling, a huge upskilling, and government policy is going to need to support that. And again, work coming out of the Work Foundation, looking at the effectiveness of skills policy is critically important, and being able to get academics to talk into that agenda. But for me, it's about the skills, it's about transitioning people from one area to the other. The other element is actually drawing on our research around in business schools. Around innovation, we work very closely with colleagues, and this is common across all good business schools, with colleagues in the STEM disciplines. So we've got a large project around hydrogen and the Heysham nuclear power station. As a management school, we're heavily involved in that. It's about supporting the innovations, the skill side, but also there's our research that can help support organizations innovate to shift to this new economy.
Yeah, it's a great point. By the way, you can ask questions for Ben and Angus. Please just put them into the chat and we'll get to as many as we can. But, this as we adapt and transition out of COVID, the world of hybrid working is taking off. And indeed, so many more of us are now working in a hybrid way and doing much more with technology and virtually. What challenges and opportunities do you see in terms of how that's going to impact work for individuals and teams and indeed for leadership and management? It's at the core of the Work Foundation.
It absolutely is. And so as you can imagine, we're really keen to sort of get under the skin of what we're likely to see next in this space. I suppose one quick, qualification before I say a little bit about how hybrid working might play out is I think ONS released some really important data just this week that shows just how varied the picture is on remote and hybrid working across the country. So, I think a key stat from there was in Burnley last year, only 13% of workers ever worked from home during the pandemic, whereas in Richmond upon Thames, it was 71%.
Yeah.
So you can see immediately that the makeup of different local economies is driving really different shifts, actually. And I think it's just important that we sort of don't lose sight of that as we sort of talk about this emergence of hybrid working. However, having said that, clearly there are many sectors for which a return to 2019 normality of 5 days in the office for most members of staff is not something which is likely to return, certainly in the short to medium term, perhaps ever. And I think you're right, Anna, that will present some challenges, but also opportunities. In one way, hybrid working is the most difficult sort of arrangement of all. It's sort of easier to imagine a world in which we're all working from home or we're all working in the office, but where you're having to manage different teams operating on a different basis, perhaps some teams in your organization will need to be on site more often than others. That will present a whole host of cultural issues, team management issues, leadership issues that I know organizations across different sectors are currently weighing up at the moment. I mean, we've spoken to a number of employers through the pandemic, and I think the thing which comes back time and again is once they've gotten over the sort of technological or the logistical challenges of shifting some of the workforce to a more remote working pattern, most have seen real advantages. So more flexibility for their members of staff have been welcomed. They've been able to drive a whole host of different efficiencies in terms of workplace processes and practices. And they're really starting to see the benefits of investing further in digital technologies, not just to enable remote working, but across their businesses. So I think, as you mentioned, we're doing some work on this at the moment, partly in tandem with colleagues of yours at the CMI.
Yeah.
I think, what we're really keen to understand is, as we're in this critical juncture now of the pandemic, as we look to be emerging from it, what kinds of decisions are employers looking to make over the next 6 to 12 months? What impact will that have across different sectors and across different places? And so we're hoping that we'll have a lot more to say on that as we get into the summer, as we sort of complete this research, getting the perspectives of employers from across the north of England, but also across the country as a whole.
Yeah, it's a fascinating area. Angus, what are your thoughts on this topic?
I mean, this is one of these odd topics where it feels very personal to academics as well as a conceptual issue, insofar as we, like everyone else, have been working remotely, delivering education remotely, now moving back into hybrid. So I'm not going to repeat anything Ben said. I just want to flag two things that feel to matter to me. One is that for many of our organizations, particularly our people-focused organizations, the culture and the sense of community is a huge asset, and how we maintain, how we strengthen that community in a very different way. Because I've got a number of colleagues who have joined the management school in the midst of the pandemic. They've not seen other people physically. They've not been on the premises. And I know this is just an example that most organizations are facing, but it raises huge questions for me in terms of how we really embed them in the community, how we embed values. So that was the first element. The second element is, it's for most organizations, I think it's taking us we've got to look really hard at what we invest in terms of capital. Is it the physical capital? Is it the pursuit of the buildings? Is it that infrastructure? Or is it the digital infrastructure? And all too often, our digital infrastructure is lagging behind the quality of our physical infrastructure. And that's even down to how decisions are made around capital expenditure, and to what extent has the digital infrastructure been sufficiently seen as part of that capital planning.
It's an absolutely excellent point you make, and it's the same point that came up in our discussion about how to address the leveling up issue. So we too readily default to the infrastructure, and what we need to be thinking about is what are the digital tools and the management and leadership challenges to manage this new world. And I think that's the excellent points that you both make. Now, of course, I'm looking forward to our research as well, and we'll have another session on that, no doubt, when it comes out. But perhaps you can share with us personally now, what is the biggest leadership lesson you've learned during this unprecedented time? And what advice would you give our listeners who may have be struggling with the pandemic's impact and their transition out of it. And maybe I'll start with you, Angus.
I suspect our experiences are very similar to those of others. So if I had to put one thing down that's hit me more than anything, has been the importance of communication.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I think we've always been reasonable on communication within the management school, within the university, but we've unequivocally had to up our game. And I think there's three reasons we've had to up our game. The first is about reassuring people. It's been a period of such horrendous uncertainty in so many ways, uncertainty of how we're working, indeed uncertainty of whether people will have jobs, what the financial implication of the pandemic has been on the organisation, what it means for being off on furlough, etc., etc. We all recognise that. Second element, I think, is looking the other way, is coping with this unprecedented change. We need to be ensuring that colleagues on the front line who have ideas, who have approaches to be able to handling the challenges we've got, are able to feed them back in. For those of us that are sitting higher up in an organisation with a broader span, we lack that fine-grained detail. Many of our frontline colleagues have got that fine. So getting that communication coming up. So when I talk about communication, it's very much been about making sure two-way communication works. And in some ways, I think the digitalization has helped us on this one. Insofar, I think some colleagues are more willing to talk, rather than put their hand up in an all-staff meeting, be actually able to talk online. And the last element about communication, I think, is around being able to articulate post-pandemic. What is it going to look like? And that ties back to the reassuring, not just reassuring about the short term, it's reassuring about the longer term. So I suppose the tail end is imagining what the future is going to look like for your organization, what the future is going to look like for your sector. But then, if I can quickly just a bit about advice, would be, I think there's a phenomenal opportunity here. It has unfrozen behaviors. It has unfrozen practices. I concede in in many instances, a fairly brutal manner, but it has opened minds to very, very different ways of working. And I think there are some considerable opportunities to reinvent what we do in our respective organizations, in our respective sectors, and how we do that, with the sting in the tail being, if we don't do it, somebody else is going to do it, and somebody else is going to go and take our market from us.
So I think that's a great perspective. I completely agree. Our research shows communication is the #1 skill in management and leadership that is needed, and the emphasis on well-being, as you say. Ben, what are your thoughts? What have you learned, and what's your advice?
Yeah, so I joined the Work Foundation just 3-4 weeks before we all went into lockdown. So my experience of the last 12 months has sort of been added to by joining a new organization, meeting a new team, but not having a huge amount of time with them in the same space. My wife also gave birth to our first child over the course of the last year as well. Thank you very much. And so I suppose it really builds on Angus's point around communication. But I suppose what I've learned and what I've sought to do over the last 12 months is in a sense bring my whole self to work and sort of be really open about the fact that this is a challenging time for everybody in the workplace, and what we need to be able to do as a team is do what we can to support one another. And in a sense, I suppose in part that is about showing one's own vulnerability to some of those challenges as much as everybody else's. And and I've tried to do that throughout. In a way, it's been hard to hide it, given those circumstances. But I think that has helped us at the Work Foundation support one another ultimately through what has been a challenging 12 to 18 months. But also, as Angus said at the very outset, an exciting one, because the world of work is changing before our very eyes. And certainly at the Work Foundation, that's what gets us out of bed in the morning, is trying to understand that and trying to shape it for the better for the future.
I think what you say is so important. We have a once-in-a-lifetime chance to reshape the world of work and make it better. So it's great that we end on that optimistic note. Let's take some questions. Our first question is from Stephen. You spoke about the need for gradual change to address the London-centric focus, but has the strategic shock of the pandemic and home working provided an opportunity for more rapid decentralization we have to grasp before we revert to previous norms? What a great question. Angus, you go first on that one.
I have huge empathy with Stephen's second point about the danger of slipping back to the way it was before. Part of me thinks it's a particularly British phenomenon, not really grasping a sort of ambitious, visionary future, but a sort of slipping back genteelly into the way we've operated. So I think we do need to seize it, and I do think there are real opportunities. And one constantly hears, "Oh well, pret-a-manger in the big cities is facing real challenges." Well, actually, I think many of us who live in smaller towns and then the satellite villages of those smaller towns, there are opportunities there for serving a community that is partly home working. So I think we could grasp. I think we do need to grasp the opportunity before it slips out of our hand, before we default back to the old ways of thinking.
Yeah, and Ben, do you think we should just be radical and go a lot faster?
Oh, I mean, I certainly wouldn't seek to advocate a sort of a passive or a gradual approach to this, because I think in a sense it's going to be the case that driving that kind of institutional change and sort of cultural change in the country will take time. But I think in order to do it, you've really got to go hard at it. And I suppose one thing I would say is, I mean, if we look at previous crises, and you see the trajectory of how places have emerged from them, accepting that this is a unique crisis that we're living through at the moment, it does tend to be those who had the most vulnerable economies going in that take the longest to recover. So I think more than anything, the pandemic and the crisis and all of the kinds of shifts that we've seen double underscore the imperative to support places to grow their economies, to develop their business bases, to support people to access skills and good jobs, because the likelihood is in the next couple of years, they're going to be the ones who find it hardest to bounce back. And we know this from the financial crisis. We know this from the crises of the 80s and the early 90s. So I think really there must be a doubling down from the government and other supporting actors on getting it right this time.
Okay, well, there's a great question from Karen that is asking, so with that in mind, what global success in other countries are we currently looking to for reference? Who's done this well? Angus?
I suppose it depends what dimension we're looking at being done well in. Because I suppose if we look coming through the pandemic, we didn't do well early on. We arguably have started to do better now. But what I think it's uncovered is the pandemic has uncovered a key thing, I think, around inequalities.
Yeah.
Inequalities within society, inequalities between places. And that is very, very stark. Other countries who have less inequality appear to have done better. So a levelling up agenda must do that. And there's a range of countries obviously there. I think looking at a longer term angle might be around how good we are at technical skills. We kind of know that we are good in the university space, but compared to Germany, compared to Singapore, we are very, very poor in the technical training space. And I think for the longer term, we want to look at what our success is going to be anchored on, is to look at the success of those countries with well-developed and arguably stable technical training, technical qualification frameworks, Germany, Singapore, etc. I think unless we get that right, unless we try and emulate those countries, we're going to perpetuate a lot of the problems we've already had.
And Ben, who would you learn from?
So I would absolutely agree with what Angus has just said. I think I would extend it even further beyond technical education. That actually, when you look at the great majority of OECD countries, there is a stark difference between the culture within those countries around adult learning and lifelong learning. The UK really does stand out as a place where actually once you've left school or you've graduated university, you may not engage in training or development again for a decade or more. And also research suggests that if you do go that long without engaging in training, you're then less likely to ever do it again. So I think really the government has identified something really important here, which is around the Prime Minister's Lifetime Skills Guarantee. But it's going to take an awful lot and a concerted policy effort to sort of shift that culture in the country so that we can emulate countries like Germany, France, Singapore, where actually there is a much better culture there around adult learning.
Indeed, in Singapore, the government gives every adult money to learn something new every year, right? So the last question we have today comes from Maria, and it's a relevant one. How do you, so Ben and Angus, see the value of professional body membership for students, especially through developing the employability skills to ensure they're ready for the workplace?
I suspect as dean of the business school, I probably need to go first on that particular one. I think very much so, because one of the things that we recognise in universities is the importance of those skills that are needed to enable students, our graduates, to translate well into the workplace as confident, competent leaders with ability to be innovative, to be sensitive in terms of working with teams, all of those types of skills. And I think there's a big element here around embedding experiential learning into our curriculum. And actually, if I can just do an aside here, I think the one thing the pandemic has done is, by forcing us to digitalize some of our delivery, it's arguably creating space within the curriculum, within the timetable, for more experiential learning. And that, I think, is an increasingly important part, creating the right practice pitch, if you like, for our students. And what professional qualifications do is they nudge us down that direction. I don't really mind whether it's CMI, whether it's CIPD, whether it's ICAEW, those professional accreditations relevant to their particular domain push us in particular directions, and look at how we can broaden that out. So yeah, professional membership. So we look at our programs and ask questions about, is it relevant that this particular program has accreditation? If it is, who does it come from?
And of course, it encourages lifelong learning, because you have to keep your CPD, your continuous professional development, up when you join. Ben, would you agree with that?
Yeah, I absolutely would. And I suppose what I would add is, one of the concerns you could have around hybrid working is that it could disrupt the onboarding of young people in particular into the labour market. Where, if one thinks back to the beginning of your career, a lot of the learning you do is almost by osmosis. It's by being in a workplace, it's by observing other people at work, copying what they do in many respects. And if we're going to lose an element of that because we're spending less time together in an office environment, then I absolutely think, that the more, as Angus says, experiential learning we can do, the higher the benefit from being part of a professional body, a membership body, where perhaps some of that gap can be filled by engaging with peers or with other experienced professionals, I think could be increasingly valuable in the future.
Yeah, it's a great point. It goes back to Angus's point about community. It's another community touch point, which is very important. Well, it's been wonderful to speak to you both. Really interesting. I will look forward to the release of our joint research on hybrid working, which will be coming soon, toward, I think, the end of June, I think it's scheduled for. And it's been a delight to have you both. Thank you for joining us today, and thank you all for listening. And if you've enjoyed this, please do consider joining CMI. You'll find out how to do so in the chat. Thank you. See you next week.
Thanks, Anne.